So we just studied Hagia Sophia, and if you have not watched that video, I suggest you watch that first before you watch this next one because there's a lot of building on or comparison. So we're going to talk about Emperor Justinian, and Emperor Justinian around 526 to 565, and he's a real important character. Justinian is the guy who's responsible for building Hagia Sophia. He's the patron of it. But he also extends his empire, and you can see that he really has at least attempted to extend his empire as far as the Roman Empire has gone, and he's done a pretty good job. We're going to find later on around 700-800, Charlemagne does a similar kind of attempt. But we're going to be zooming in on a place in northern Italy called Ravenna. And what I want to suggest is if Constantinople is the center of Justinian's empire, then the next place we're going to go to, Ravenna, is actually almost a backwater. Notice how far away Italy is from Constantinople. And so the church that Justinian builds at Ravenna is this church that actually Charlemagne later on thought was totally the bomb. He thought it was the best thing ever, and that it was a classic church, but it actually is a little bit of a lesser church than Hagia Sophia. So let's take a look at it. The exterior of San Vitale is basically just brick and terracotta roofing, and it's not a very fancy kind of church from the exterior, except for the fact that it seems like a bunch of layers of half domes and other structures that are embraced against the side of it. It does have some of those typical Roman arches that we studied earlier. If you look at it, it actually has a series of sort of semi-dome-like structures, but it doesn't have a lot of carving and it doesn't have a lot of ornamentation on the exterior. And I guess you could say that a little bit about Hagia Sophia, but Hagia Sophia is much more imposing. The floor plan of San Vitale is actually a central church plan, but it's not a fancy central church plan like we saw at Hagia Sophia. What I'm suggesting is it's almost like a wedding cake with an extra structure on top. You have this sort of octagonal structure that has side chapels and has these extra stairways that lead off to other areas. But then in the center, the central domed area, which is not really a true dome, for instance, like the Pantheon, is this extra structure that's almost like a structure that's supported by its own set of piers and its own set of columns on the rim of it. So the outer area of San Vitale doesn't really necessarily support the central gallery and the central nave or dome area in the interior. And the building is not integrated in terms of how it shunts the support the same way Hagia Sophia is. Now, it does have some kind of innovative things going on in terms of the inner structure of the walls, which I think are worthy of mentioning. For instance, the walls themselves have pots in them that are almost like an egg crate kind of design. They're amphorae or oval pots that are meant to lighten the load of the arches and the walls and are placed inside the walls as an adjunct or as an extra that would support the interior walls but without making them very heavy. So what they were attempting to do is lighten the masonry as we got near the top so that the arches and domes would work on it. So let's go inside the building. The interior of the building is completely decorated with mosaic and it's very tall, it's very imposing when you get inside, and so you can see why it would be a building that is worthy of notice or mention. And we can see that it still uses a lot of the traditional Roman building techniques that we talked about, where we have these arches, we have a lot of cement being used, we have in some places cross groin vaults, but I think that the most significant part of it is actually the mosaics that are on the interior of it, because I think that they relate a lot more to the visual tradition of painting and drawing and fresco making, and these mosaics are also, in terms of their iconography or symbols used, are really significant in how they express more complex Catholic and Christian ideas as they develop into the 5th and 6th centuries of the Catholic and the Holy Roman Empire. For instance, if we look at this archway here, and we zoom a little bit in on the archway, we can actually see that the archways are almost like triumphal arches that we saw, the Arch of Titus and the Arch of Constantine. And the supporting members inside the arch are these mosaics that show a lot of the apostles and saints that are important to the development of the church and the development of Catholicism. So you can almost see them as kind of little portraits that serve as caryatid kind of figures that run up and in through the interior of the archway. If we look at other areas in the church, you can actually see that the capitals and columns and the types of marbles that are being used, it's a bit of a departure from some of the other things that we've been looking at. And we can see that the columns themselves are made out of a sort of multicolored and striated marble. The capitals have two capitals on them, a capital and then something called an impost block. And when we study this a little bit more in depth later on, we're going to study the fresco, the mosaic that we see above the archway is a depiction of Abraham and Isaac. And then we're also going to study another depiction of Justinian and his entourage, more or less, in the apse of the church as well. But what I want to do first is see the relationship of religious texts to the actual artwork that's being depicted inside San Vitale. Some of you may be familiar with the 91st Psalm, and it's a significant psalm, and you'll have different wordings depending on what church you go to. But I think that what's more important is one of the stanzas that I have here sort of highlighted in yellow, and how it's translated in some ways into this mosaic that's actually not in the Church of Ravenna, but from the palace. But it is significant. And the reason why I'm showing it to you is it's going to later on relate to, for instance, when we study Amiens and some other of the cathedrals, the 91st Psalm really relates and is depicted in sculpture and in mosaic quite a bit. So if you look at the stanza, it says, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent." And if you look at this mosaic, you can actually see that that's a visual representation of Jesus trampling the lion and trampling the cobra. And he's almost holding that cross as if it was a weapon. And he's got this book in his hands, which could be the Libris Mundi. It could also be the Bible. And he's dressed in military clothing, in Roman garb, in the role of a military leader. And that's one of the things that kind of comes up in the Byzantine era, where artwork starts to take on, especially in the Christian context, that these are Christian soldiers who are defending Christianity. And so Jesus is actually kind of an emperor rather than a religious leader in his depiction, and that he is defending the faith, he is protecting people. And that is significantly a theme that we see, a unification of religion with empire in the Byzantine era. And we're going to see that specifically in the depiction of Justinian and his wife Theodora in a minute. So let's start by first looking at Emperor Justinian and his attendants, or his entourage. Well, if you look at his shield here on the left-hand side, you can see it has what's called the Chi Rho symbol on it. And that's the symbol that, when we mentioned Constantine, he fought under it. It's that cross-like form that we saw earlier that is, it's not really the Latin cross that we had encountered earlier, or that you guys know as the symbol of the emperor. The next thing that I want you to notice is that the way that this painting, or it's a mosaic, excuse me, this mosaic is developed, it says Maximus at the top, so he is the Pontiff Maximus again. So he's kind of depicting himself as the Pope, not necessarily as the emperor, but he is also the emperor. So what I'm talking about here is he's standing in the center of this composition. On his right-hand side, not ours, that's the left-hand side of the picture, are his military leaders, and they are standing by the shield that has the Chi Rho on it, and they have spears. Then he's flanked, more or less, by a series of his attendants who happen to be religious leaders. One of them on the far right-hand side has actually the incense brazier, and then we have actually I think the figure who's supposed to be the Pope, at least the bishop, and then in the center, Maximus, Justinian, is standing in a purple robe with a halo around his head, and he is carrying the silver sort of or golden bowl that actually has the Eucharist or the wafer in it. And so he is being depicted here as the Pope who is distributing the sacraments. There are a bunch of ideas here that I think are worthy or significant that will translate later on into some of the other things that you will be studying. So I wanted to talk about them as a sort of shopping list of ideas. First of all, the composition is symmetrical with the most important character in the center of the composition. So that provides a hierarchy, and you know who the most important guy is as he's in the center. And, you know, I would venture to say he's a little bit taller than the other people, and he also has a bunch of things that represent his power. For instance, he has a halo around his head, he has a crown, he's wearing a purple gown, and there's actually a story about Theodora and Justinian. Theodora, his wife, was actually either a dancing girl or sort of a prostitute that he took in off the street. And at one point, Justinian's rule was threatened, and she said to him, "I would rather die in purple than live in rags," when he suggested they split town or leave. He's holding the Eucharist, and you know, you have to have a lot of magical power or religious power to hold the Eucharist and be able to administer that. The other thing he has on his right-hand side, and remember, his right-hand men are the military leaders, he has the Chi Rho, which is the symbol of power that Constantine fought under. We also have 12 advisors or 12 apostles. You know, the 12 advisors, if you count it off, you can actually see some figures hidden behind the soldiers, are representations that he is kind of like a re-upped version of Jesus again, that he has 12 advisors or 12 people with him. And so the last thing that I want to suggest is the characterizations or caricature of the figure. He's a caricature of the human face because they're de-emphasizing the physical. And so if you look at them, the way they're standing, there's no real physical weight on their bodies. They're not standing in contrapposto anymore. So we've lost the wet drapery style. We've lost a shift of weight. We've lost a lot of the naturalism that happens. These are diagrammatic, very clear representations of the figure. It's almost like they're floating a little bit rather than being represented. If we zoom in a little bit on his face, we can see that he's very much like that mosaic that we saw from Hagia Sophia, that he's got that elongated nose, the overly large eyes that are a little bit like the Kouros figures from ancient Greece. The mouth is sort of moved down into the chin. And so we get a sense that this is a likeness of him, but it's not a verist likeness like we had, you know, in particular from ancient Rome. So this is a sort of updated version, and this is how the artwork is going to look. This is a typical Byzantine representation or stylization of the human face. So let's take a closer look at his wife, Justinian, and the Empress, who is actually across the apse from him. It's a mosaic in the apse that represents him holding the Eucharist. He's holding actually the bread and or the wafer, and she is going to be holding the wine. And here she is, Empress Theodora. And you can see that she is standing in that typical symbol of the pilgrim, that shell symbol that we saw many times before. We saw in Dura Europos. She is holding the goblet. Now think about this. Actually, in San Vitale, that we are looking at, they actually had a division. The women could only stand in the upper galleries and could not be in the main floor. Men were only allowed in the main floor. So to have a woman and representations of a female and the Empress holding actually the wine that's part of the Eucharist is a pretty big deal. She is standing again with her attendants. And her attendants are kind of almost in a way, a cognate to the apostles. And so she's standing under a sort of semi-triumphal arch. She's got her attendants who are dressed in Byzantine clothing, and she is wearing a headdress, which is basically like a crown that we see, and she is also dressed in purple. And her face is also stylized in the same way that we saw the other faces. And we see around her luxurious wealth, this fountain. And water, controlling water and that kind of thing is a really important kind of motif. And we even see sort of Roman style motifs, for instance, this sort of egg and dart pattern in the architrave-like design that's running above her head. Located in the apse, or just outside the apse, leading to where we just looked at the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora, is a mosaic above an archway that depicts the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac. The sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac is basically a story that is going to come up again and again in art history. And we're actually going to see it in some significant wall panels and also the doors of the Florence Cathedral. So it's kind of important to know the story, and you might even want to look it up in the Bible and read it for yourself. Basically what this panel represents is a continuous narrative. And a continuous narrative is all episodes of a story are told at the same time in the same picture plane. And it's also a typology or a typological exegesis. And what I'm talking about is Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac because God asked him to. And we've seen this in the Synagogue of Dura Europos as well. Has almost exactly the same kind of iconography, at least in one of the scenes. So if we look at the left-hand side, it's not the beginning of the story. And I think that's kind of important because what we're seeing is the story itself is being told in several segments, but not necessarily in a left to right kind of order. The story really begins in the right-hand segment of the mosaic. What we see here is Abraham, who is about to sacrifice his son Isaac because God asked him to. And it's a way of proving faith. And we see Abraham looking up into the sky. His hand is literally being held by the hand of God and saying, don't sacrifice him. Thank you for making the offer. I really appreciate it. But here I have provided a ram in the thicket for you, and you can sacrifice him instead. So later on in the story, we have these three sort of mysterious visitors that come to visit, and in front of them are hot crossed buns, which are actually symbols of the sacrament. So it's kind of a schema and correction on the original story, and they are basically three angelic visitations. And we see in the doorway Abraham's wife, and he is bringing in the sacrifice. So the main idea behind this mosaic is that Abraham is one of these characters from the Old Testament who's willing to make the ultimate sacrifice of killing his own son in honor of God because God asked him to, and it's complete obedience to God, and in this case, God the Father. And we see the end of the story is that he sort of gets his reward, which is basically he has visitations by angelic creatures, and he gets to remain faithful and in the right-hand side of God, and he gets to participate in the Christian, Jewish, and Catholic religions. The last thing that I wanted to look at in San Vitale is very similar to the capital of the column that we looked at in Hagia Sophia in the last lecture, which is basically a capital that has a series of ornately carved decorations that are organic that I think really relate somewhat to the kinds of decorations that were in textiles and even in contemporary decoration on regular sort of objects throughout the world in Constantinople. And then we see after that, there's a little block of stone that has this cross between it and these two horses facing it, which is called an impost block. And then above it, we see another mosaic. And so what I'm suggesting is this is a Byzantine column with its capital, with an extra impost block, and then we see the mosaic above it. And all of this imagery is heavily influenced by the interaction that Catholicism and Christianity is having with the Asian worlds and with the Middle Eastern worlds that are really running through Constantinople, which obviously is Turkey today, and Istanbul. And a lot of this stuff is starting to really influence Byzantine art. A kind of interesting addition to this for me is that later on, if you happen to look up Aachen Cathedral and Charlemagne, you're going to see that Charlemagne actually sent people to San Vitale to study it because he felt that it was really a classic Roman structure, and what he was trying to do was actually reproduce or preserve the Roman Empire in around 700 or 800 Common Era.